This MMTLP presentation is the most comprehensive and perhaps the most important video I've ever made. On August 8, 2023, Brenda Hamilton published her first blog post concerning the events surrounding Torchlight and Metamaterials. This was followed by two more posts, one on June 26, 2024, and another on August 13, 2024. These lengthy blog posts cover a significant amount of information. However, Hamilton writes from the perspective that the CEOs are criminals, investors are uninformed, and regulators are incapable of intentionally misleading the market. Even a cursory glance at the blog titles makes it clear that Hamilton focuses solely on topics that cast the CEOs and companies in a negative light. She omits any mention of TradeStation's admission of an MMTLP imbalance that prevented them from processing transfer requests. She barely touches on the MMTLP FOIA Thread. She ignores the former Metamaterials CEO's collaboration with the trustee to understand the Metamaterials board's decisions. She fails to address the FINRA UPC committee that halted MMTLP and the exposure to MMTLP short positions by the firms they represented. Hamilton also neglects to address the discrepancy between FINRA's estimated MMTLP short interest and the next Bridge Hydrocarbons statement regarding a share request from a single entity that exceeded FINRA's estimate. With Hamilton's proven knowledge of market rules, including FINRA's Rule 6490, why doesn't she question the multiple ways FINRA mishandled the MMTLP corporate actions? Finally, she has yet to post about the CEO's motions to dismiss the SEC charges. As someone who should be impartial, Hamilton's narrow focus is highly questionable. This video addresses many of her assertions and includes a substantial amount of information that she omitted. Reflecting on the entirety of these events highlights the significance of FINRA's refusal to disclose the broker-dealers responsible for making MMTLP tradable. While an exemption may allow a security to be traded without the issuer's consent, the responsibility to provide accurate and current information remains. If everything regarding the MMTLP listing was above board, there would be no reason to conceal the responsible parties. Because these parties remain unknown, most detractors continue to focus on the issuers and investors. However, evidence points to the involvement of GTS Securities and Canaccord Genuity. Examining their disclosure histories and the connections to GTS CEO Ari Rubenstein begins to explain why withholding this information might benefit FINRA's narrative if GTS is indeed involved. For example, a Congressional Research Service report dated August 21, 2023, and titled Meme Stock, MMTLP and FINRA Trading Halt, includes links to articles by Alexander Osipovich and Brandon Koch-Kodin. With a little research, both writers can be linked to Ari Rubenstein, the CEO of GTS Securities. Ari Rubenstein was also a co-founder of the now-defunct Modern Markets Initiative, a high-frequency trading lobbyist organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. Is it possible that Eva Su, the writer of the MMTLP CRS report, was influenced by someone associated with Ari's Modern Markets Initiative? Is there a link between Ari Rubenstein and Brenda Hamilton? As this presentation proceeds, I remind viewers that these videos are designed to be watched. The visuals provide supporting evidence for the dialogue and sometimes contain information not explicitly mentioned in the narration. This is MMTLP 101, also known as the case against Brenda Hamilton. Brenda Hamilton, a securities lawyer with over 25 years of experience, also educates the public via her securities lawyer 101.com legal blog. In 2017, Hamilton's Securities Lawyer 101 blog was voted first place for legal news by Expert Institute and second place in 2018. Hamilton is also recognized as being within the top 1% on LinkedIn, which, according to an April 2013 24/7 press release, Hamilton attributes the distinction to her firm's leading role in representing microcap issuers in SEC investigations, matters involving the DTC, and, of course, her Securities Lawyer 101 blog. Her expertise spans areas such as IPOs, direct public offerings, securities law compliance, and representation of various market participants, including issuers, broker-dealers, hedge funds, and participants in SEC investigations, to name a few. Given her extensive experience and significant online presence, one might expect Hamilton to adhere strictly to ethical considerations and professional standards. But as we examine her coverage of TRCH, MMAT, MMTLP, and everything in between, it becomes clear that she's lacking in the areas of objectivity, accuracy, context, and potentially the disclosure of conflicts. Hamilton's extensive experience and accolades lend her a degree of credibility. However, her unwavering adherence to a narrative seemingly influenced, if not dictated, by FINRA and the SEC suggests a potential compromise. Despite her reputation, Hamilton's inability to deviate from the same tactics used by the regulators just casts doubt on her objectivity as a reliable source. In a 2018 blog post, Hamilton demonstrated her understanding of FINRA Rule 6490. She accurately described the procedural requirements, including the issuer's obligation to provide notice to FINRA at least 10 business days before the record date of a corporate action. FINRA's role is to then process the corporate action before it can be made effective. This process includes conducting a detailed review of the issuer's submission and possibly requesting additional documents or information. The important thing to note is that nowhere in this blog post does Hamilton mention FINRA's ability to modify or amend an issuer's corporate action submission, nor does she mention FINRA's ability to revise an issuer's corporate action without input from the issuer. However, in a 2024 blog post titled Metamaterials Executives John Berda and George Palikaras charged with market manipulation, fraud, and other violations, Hamilton seems to have neglected certain key details. But before getting into this, we have to note that in 2023, Hamilton had already written a blog post when the SEC issued a Wells notice to Berda, Palikaras, and Metamaterials. It was in this post that Hamilton provides evidence of her ability to competently research some of the origins of Metamaterials and how they came to be involved with Torchlight. But she either misinterprets some of the information right before her eyes, or she intentionally misleads her audience. When she writes concerning how Metamaterials would handle the assets of Torchlight, she says the following: MMAT, which describes itself as a disruptive company that invents, designs, develops, and manufactures scalable, sustainable, highly functional materials and intelligent surfaces, had no interest in getting into the oil business, and so Torchlight's assets would be sold off. This was mostly accurate, but what Hamilton leaves out is that the plan was to either sell the assets or conduct a spin-off into another entity that would hold the assets. It's baffling that she leaves out this tidbit of information because she both links to the December 14, 2020 Torchlight and Metamaterial joint PR, where they explain this, and she directly embeds a quote from the PR that highlights this exact point. Torchlight shareholders on the record date will be entitled to receive a preferred stock dividend payable immediately prior to the closing of the transaction that entitles them to their pro rata share of any proceeds resulting from any sale of Torchlight's oil and gas assets that occurs on the earlier of December 31st, 2021, or 6 months from the closing of the transaction, and, after such time, if such sales are not complete, will be entitled to receive a pro rata equity interest in a spin-off entity that holds Torchlight's remaining oil and gas assets, subject to certain conditions. Fast forward to Hamilton's 2024 blog about the SEC charges, and she has this to say. Brenda also knowingly or severely, recklessly, failed to disclose that he had laid the foundation for a spin-off of Torchlight's oil and gas assets into a new entity as early as December 2020, mere days after the definitive agreement for the merger between Torchlight and Meta was signed. In particular, beginning in December 2020, Brenda circulated to Torchlight's chairman and other insiders presentations outlining capital formation plans for a spin-off entity, the spin-off entity. He did not publicly disclose these plans. So, to recap, first Hamilton claimed in her 2023 post that the plan was to only sell the Torchlight assets, but she embeds a quote and links to the definitive agreement that announced that the assets will either be sold or spun off. Then, in her 2024 post, she appears to acknowledge that the spin-off was always a possibility. But the problem is that days after announcing that a spin-off was a possibility, Brenda, knowingly or severely recklessly, began to lay the plans for a spin-off. The argument being made here is that even though they made it clear that the plan was to either sell the assets or spin off the assets into another company by making preparations for a spin-off in the event that the assets weren't sold, they misled investors. But wouldn't it have been a worse predicament if the assets weren't sold and the process for effectuating a spin-off wasn't in place? What Hamilton also leaves out is that with more than 2 months left in 2021, the Series A preferred share became tradable as MMTLP against the wishes of Metamaterials. It's my understanding that this occurrence didn't automatically make selling the assets impossible, but we'll never know if a buyer would have made an offer if the assets were never associated with so much controversy. Anyone that would have purchased the assets after they became tradable would find themselves in a situation similar to what we're witnessing with Bridge Hydrocarbons, a company hampered by their inability to fully identify their shareholders. The SEC, and by extension, Brenda Hamilton, are putting John Brenda and George Palikaris on trial for doing exactly what was included in their definitive agreement. The SEC and Hamilton make the assumption that investors didn't understand that there were 2 possible outcomes. At the same time, they've completely ignored the fact that FINRA refused to act in regards to the complaints made by these same individuals when the Series A preferred share became tradable. After the completion of the reverse merger, and after a short duration of time, depending on your brokerage, investors that held TRCH through the merger received their Series A preferred share placeholders. These shares just sat in accounts with an identifier. There was no standard trading symbol, no price, and no trading. Hamilton doesn't mention any of this. She instead states that Torchlight shareholders received 164,923,363 shares of the Series A preferred. She then continues, MMTLP entered the picture as the preferred stock dividend payable immediately prior to the closing of the transaction that entitles them to their pro rata share of any proceeds resulting from any sale of Torchlight's oil and gas assets. Hamilton then points out that MMTLP began trading on October 6, 2021. This is how briefly she explains the controversy surrounding MMTLP becoming tradable. It seems not to have been meant to trade at all. Meta did not seek to have it listed on the Nasdaq. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority later said that a single market maker had asked that it be given a ticker because he had an unsolicited order from a customer. FINRA didn't find the request unusual and assigned MMTLP to the stock. In these 4 sentences, Hamilton minimizes the significance of the issuer never intending for MMTLP to become tradable. There's a reoccurring theme in Hamilton's MMTLP-related blog posts. She gives very little attention or no attention at all to the facts that bring credibility to the issuers and investors of TRCH, MMAT, and MMTLP. An example of this can be seen when you jump ahead to her blog post about John Berda and George Palikaris being charged by the SEC. In it, she states the following: and consistent with the first dividend that led to the preferred stock being created out of Torchlight common shares, once again, the resulting shares from this dividend would not be made available for trading on any exchange, which was carefully noted in the next bridge S1. Hamilton then embedded this portion of the S1. Meta currently owns all the outstanding shares of common stock of the company Next Bridge, and we have not sought to have the shares of common stock traded on any exchange. Accordingly, there is currently no public market for the common stock, and there is no current expectation for a public market to develop for the common stock. What Hamilton has shown in the SEC charging Berda and Palikaris post is that she clearly possesses the ability to locate, read, and share quotes from documents that verify the assertions made by the issuer. So why didn't she bother to do the same in the Wells Notice post? It's because the truth about how the Series A preferred share became tradable as MMTLP doesn't fit the narrative that she's attempting to push. In the SEC charges Berda and Palikaris post, Hamilton describes what occurred leading up to the U3 halt of MMTLP as John Berda's TRCH plan, but in reverse. She describes it as follows. He manipulated the Torchlight stock price by giving Torchlight common shareholders a preferred stock dividend and using that dividend and short squeeze rumours as fuel. But this time, the preferred stockholders were being given a common stock dividend in Next Bridge, and once again, short squeeze rumours would be the gasoline, only this time to manipulate the MMTLP share price. Don't you recognise that Hamilton's emphasis on what John Berda allegedly did wrong takes the attention away from the fact that TRCH was being manipulated and the regulators never stepped in? Is it a coincidence that now with MMTLP, the attention is being placed on the alleged scheme to manipulate the price and cause a squeeze, but nobody is asking about the party that made MMTLP tradable and why they did so? It's worth repeating, Hamilton never mentions that George Palikaris complained to FINRA shortly after the Series A preferred share became tradable as MMTLP, nor does she mention that the information used was both incorrect and outdated, which should have immediately prompted FINRA to cease trading in October of 2021. Rule 15C211 is designed to ensure that quotations for securities are fair and accurate. It imposes various obligations on firms that participate in quotation facilities, including certain information about the securities they quote, such as the issuer's name, the securities type, and the current bid and ask prices. FINRA Form 211 is a crucial document in the realm of securities trading. It serves as an application to initiate or resume quotations for securities on platforms like the OTC Bulletin Board or OTC Link ATS. But Rule 15 C211 provides exemptions for certain types of securities or market participants. These exemptions might be based on factors like the size of the issuer, the nature of the security, or the market maker's role. In and around the year 2020, when there were proposals to amend Rule 15 C211, Hamilton submitted a comment letter in support of the amendments. The same can be said for Ari Rubenstein, CEO of GTS Securities, whom we'll learn more about later. Hamilton also made several posts about the rule in that time frame and beyond, one of which is titled, "How does a sponsoring market maker get a ticker? Form 211 and Rule 15C 211. Here's one quote that stands out from this particular blog entry. The private company seeking to go public should have at least 1 million shares outstanding, of which at least 250,000 are free trading shares. Why this stands out is because there were no free trading shares in the Series A preferred share that became MMTLP. They were not registered and had not been held by anyone for 6 months at the time that they became tradable. Tom Hornish of Wilson Sonsini, the attorney for MMAT, was made aware of this issue at the time, but didn't respond appropriately. What exemption did they rely on? It really doesn't matter, because FINRA knows, Hamilton knows, and anyone else familiar with Rule 15 C211 should also know that no matter the exemption, they were still required to submit accurate and current information. For Brenda Hamilton to have been in securities for more than 2 decades, and to have proven knowledge of rules like FINRA's 6490 and Rule 15 C211, it comes as a surprise that her blog posts neglect to cite these rules and whether or not they were adhered to in her multiple posts concerning MMTLP. This also begs the question as to who exactly is her audience for these posts. Because for years, Hamilton has been educating her readers about these very rules, but now that there's an opportunity to show them being effectively utilised, they're a no-show. This is what's known as a gigantic red flag. And we've seen this before with FINRA, because even though FINRA does cite Rule 15 C211 in their initial MMTLP FAQ, they failed to properly describe which exception or exceptions were utilised and why they precluded the market participants from including current information, as well as facing any negative consequences for their failure to do so. Along this same vein, FINRA alludes to their Rule 6490 in their initial FAQ, but they didn't bother citing or linking to the rule like they did with 15C211. This was especially odd when you recognised that the whole purpose of the FAQ was to answer questions about the corporate action and the trading halt. The irony here is multi-layered, and I would imagine would have also been impossible for an experienced FINRA employee to recognise. One of the reasons Rule 6490 exists is to ensure that a corporate action doesn't include an issue related to settlement and clearance. Rule 6440, which provides the criteria by which FINRA can halt trading, in the case of MMTLP, it was due to an issue related to settlement and clearance. By the literal definition of FINRA Rule 6490, it is FINRA's obligations to foster cooperation and coordination of the clearing, settling, and processing of transactions. So it's obvious that FINRA wouldn't want to draw attention to this. But let's pretend the issue was really a surprise that caught FINRA off guard. Once MMTLP was U3 halted, it didn't relieve them of their obligations to foster cooperation and coordination of the clearing, settling, and processing of transactions. So when FINRA included in their UPC halt notice for MMTLP that the trading halt would end concurrently with the deletion of the trading symbol. What they were doing was willfully refusing their obligation to foster cooperation and coordination of the clearing, settling and processing of MMTLP transactions. And if I was a party to this type of activity, I also wouldn't want to cite or provide links to the rules that would make this obvious. In order to fully understand MMTLP, you have to be aware of what happened to TRCH. Brenda Hamilton demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding in her account of the perceived amount of short positions related to MMTLP. This is evident when Hamilton says the following in her Wells Notices blog post. Somewhere along the line, a fairly small number of traders bewitched by dreams of enormous zip code changing short squeezes became aware of MMTLP. For reasons not clear to us, they became convinced the preferred had been excessively shorted, and probably shorted naked. In reality, there was never enough volume to suggest that any kind of shorts were seriously interested. The truth is that TRCH was a target of naked short selling from as early as 2014. This information was shared by John Berda in a January 2023 discussion with GNS CEO Roger Hamilton. According to Berda, a discrepancy was discovered in a bi-weekly TRCH short report, when 2 million shares that were reported short just 2 weeks prior were no longer appearing in the Nasdaq short report. When the Nasdaq rep investigated the matter, he discovered that the shares were moved offshore, and due to the fact that they were moved, it was no longer under US purview, so FINRA no longer counted those missing 2 million TRCH short positions as being short. This meant that their short reports were useless. In an October 2022 FINRA FAQ, the following question and answer was included. Is a firm required to report short interest positions that are held overseas at a separate legal entity and are not reflected on the firm's books and records? No. FINRA member firms only are required to report all short positions that are held in each individual firm or customer account, including the account of a broker-dealer, that are reflected on the firm's books and records, as described in Rule 4560. This loophole basically allows market participants to destroy the share prices of the companies they target, ultimately forcing them into bankruptcy and eliminating all opportunities for issuers to achieve long-term shareholder value. Berda mentioned that he became aware of the TRCH short positions getting moved offshore in 2014. This was also the same year that Torchlight acquired the lease to the assets that would eventually be known as MMTLP. Then, in 2019, Seeking Alpha, a website known for being used by short sellers to publicize hit pieces, published an article called Torchlight Energy. We believe its Oro Grande project is worthless. Management has a questionable past, 90% downside. Hamilton mentions this hit piece, as well as the hit piece aimed at MMAT, in her SEC Charges, Berda and Palikaras blog. But she didn't mention the MMTLP hit piece in the Wells Notice blog. Also, when she references them, she refers to them as research reports. She also says that it's obvious that neither of the authors naked shorted the security they wrote about, because according to Hamilton, they fully disclosed their positions at the time. This is misleading because, of course, neither firm would admit to naked shorting, but she also neglected to mention what those positions were that they disclosed. Kerrisdale did in fact have a short position in MMAT. Hamilton misleads her audience all throughout her blog posts pertaining to TRCH, MMAT, and MMTLP. This is just another example of carefully worded paragraphs that leave out key information in order to protect every reputation except for the trading symbols in question. And even if the authors of the hit pieces didn't have positions, it wouldn't mean there weren't other market participants that could have been involved in shorting and/or potentially naked shorting these securities. By 2021, when John Berda looked back at all that transpired, he was able to recognize that the short and distort manipulation, including the hit pieces, Torchlight being under investigation, TRCH trading on foreign exchanges, and TRCH appearing on the regulation SHO threshold list due to excessive failures to deliver, also known as FTDs. All of this is what Patrick Byrne of Overstock said happened to his company. While Hamilton and the SEC have chosen to build a case around the way they perceive the actions of John Berda and George Palikaris, they've neglected to address the loophole that is hiding short interest overseas, which, by the way, is in violation of Dodd-Frank. The messaging from regulators is that they know it's their job to protect investors, but it's too burdensome to close the overseas loophole. If your company becomes a target for manipulation, this is unfortunate for you and your shareholders, but just be a better company or file for bankruptcy. This is the real scheme that the SEC should be pursuing, but instead, they're focused on the issuers that try to protect their shareholders. If John Berda and Torchlight would have just relied on reverse splits to maintain compliance, the market makers would have continued to deploy their infinite liquidity, shorting TRCH, diluting shareholders until they eventually filed for bankruptcy and lost their oil and gas assets. In May of 2020, a worldwide pandemic was our reality. Oil was negative $37 a barrel, and Torchlight knew they were in no position to raise capital for drilling, which would have meant they were going to lose their primary oil and gas asset. Recognizing the strategic importance of their Nasdaq listing, the Torchlight Energy Resources board sought to preserve shareholder value amidst a challenging market environment. This led them to seek potential reverse merger candidates, which resulted in them choosing Metamaterials. At the time of the merger agreement with Metamaterials in December 2020, Torchlight's share price was trading near 30 cents, and reported short interest was approximately 5 million shares. But keep in mind that this was only the short interest that was reported. By February 2021, the company had become debt-free, and increased investor interest led to a further rise in short interest. Following a positive assessment from Roth Capital, Torchlight considered a capital raise to capitalize on market demand. Given John Berda's experience in capital markets, the board approached this opportunity with caution, establishing stringent criteria for potential investors. When Torchlight decided to proceed with a $25 million offering, they carefully evaluated investor interest. A single fund expressed interest in acquiring the entire offering, but their history of shorting TRCH raised concerns. This fund was ultimately denied shares. Instead, Torchlight allocated shares to funds with a demonstrated history of support and excluded those known to have violated Regulation M or engaged in short-selling practices. These funds were deemed unlikely to contribute to the company's long-term success and were viewed as opportunistic market players. Shortly after the announcement of the offering, Torchlight's share price experienced a temporary decline. However, investors quickly recognized the positive implications of the deal, which did not involve funds that had previously shorted the company. This dynamic meant that the only way short sellers could close their positions was by purchasing shares in the open market. Here's where irony creeps in. At the same time that Torchlight was making sure they weren't getting in bed with predatory funds, Brenda Hamilton was on a crusade to get the SEC to hear her thoughts about their Rule 144. This is an excerpt from Hamilton's February 15, 2021, comment letter to Vanessa Countryman. Small public companies need all the protections they can get. They are often undercapitalized and have difficulty attracting the financing necessary to grow their businesses. Consequently, many turn in desperation to lenders who impose conditions on their loans that are likely to result in considerable dilution. Management of these companies is often unsophisticated and inexperienced. Some fail entirely to understand the possible consequences of accepting financing involving market-adjustable securities. The Commission's proposals will prevent much of the damage caused by these securities, but they will do nothing to enable these small companies to obtain the effective and legitimate financing they need. Market-adjustable securities are also known as toxic convertibles. These may be promissory notes, warrants, or preferred stock. They are convertible into the issuer's common shares or other equity securities at a hefty discount to the market, and they are flawless, meaning having no minimum conversion price specified in the relative financing agreement. While not directly comparable, Hamilton expressed concern about the potential for less sophisticated companies to enter into financing arrangements that may have negative consequences for the company and its shareholders. This approach stands in stark contrast to the strategic steps taken by Torchlight within the same time period. Also, it appears that preferred stock has a negative connotation in the eyes of Hamilton, due to its association to market-adjustable securities, also known as toxic convertibles. This is what it boils down to. The SEC and Brenda Hamilton have characterized the reverse merger as a punitive measure against short sellers. However, it's more likely that it was the only viable option to prevent Torchlight Energy Resources from bankruptcy. While the company's actions may have inadvertently resulted in financial losses for short sellers, this was a consequence of their own manipulative behavior. Now, we have to return to this quote from Hamilton's Wells Notice blog post. Somewhere along the line, a fairly small number of traders, bewitched by dreams of enormous, zip code-changing short squeezes, became aware of MMTLP. For reasons not clear to us, they became convinced the preferred had been excessively shorted, and probably shorted naked. In reality, there was never enough volume to suggest that any kind of shorts were seriously interested. We just discussed the fact that there's evidence suggesting that short interest in TRCH was being hidden overseas for upwards of 6 years when it was trading on the Nasdaq. The high in TRCH leading into the merger was somewhere in the $11 range. Anyone short TRCH before the reverse merger should have been aware that if they held on to their short positions, they would then be obligated to provide 1/2 share of MMAT due to the reverse split, and 1 share of the Series A preferred share in order to close each share of TRCH shorted. Metamaterials was a green company. They couldn't continue to be associated with Torchlight's oil and gas assets. Torchlight's investors held TRCH through the merger because they were under the impression that it was the only way to get the Series A preferred share that would represent Torchlight's oil and gas assets. Regardless of anyone's current opinion of the legitimacy of this plan, it was reviewed by and made effective by the SEC. So Brenda Hamilton would have you believe that multiple years of hidden short interest, and what she refers to as a scheme to make short sellers pay, only resulted in TRCH reaching just above $11, and that it was foolish for a fairly small number of traders to believe MMTLP was excessively shorted. But Hamilton completely sidesteps the evolving memos that the Options Clearing Corporation distributed only to select market participants. The June 21, 2021 memo shows that options for TRCH became available for the first time just before the reverse merger. This was highly unusual, as it would have required a lengthy review process, and to do so with an impending reverse merger had the potential to cause confusion among investors. Maybe this is the reason household investors weren't notified. What's interesting about this first memo, and what shows that Torchlight wasn't involved, is that the memo both says that it doesn't know the trading status of the Series A preferred share, but it also references the May 20th, 21 Torchlight proxy that indicated the shares wouldn't be listed on a national securities exchange. Then, on the second page under the header Delayed Settlement, it reads as follows: the TRCH component of the TRCH1 deliverable will settle through National Securities Clearing Corporation, NSCC. OCC will delay settlement of the Series A preferred share component of the TRCH1 deliverable until the trading status of Series A preferred shares is determined. Upon determination of the trading status of Series A preferred shares, OCC will require put exercisers and call assignees to deliver the appropriate number of shares. So, again, Brenda Hamilton makes it sound like investors were foolish for believing there was an abundance of short interest in MMTLP due to there not being volume, but she completely ignores the fact that the Options Clearing Corporation provided an escape, seemingly telegraphing that the Series A preferred share would become tradable, even though they knew that the proxy indicated that shares weren't expected to become tradable. Days after the initial memo, the June 25, 2021 memo provides an update that explains how options would be affected by the 1-for-2 MMAT reverse split, etc. In a sign that Torchlight and Metamaterials still weren't involved with the creation of this memo also included the information about delayed settlement for the Series A preferred share. According to the January 25th memo, OCC will delay settlement of the Series A preferred share component of the MMAT1 deliverable until the trading status of Series A preferred shares is determined. Upon determination of the trading status of Series A preferred shares, OCC will require put exercisers and call assignees to deliver the appropriate number of shares. More about the memos later. The SEC filed charges against the Atlas Trading Group on December 14, 2022. This date is easy to remember because it was on this date, after market close, that the next Bridge Hydrocarbons shares were to be distributed and the MMTLP shares were to be cancelled. FINRA never included the correct MMTLP share cancellation date in either corporate action, and the revised corporate action no longer included the December 14th distribution date. We'll come back to this later. In this video, AWS Re LN Vent 2023 FINRA CAT Overcoming Challenges When Big Data Becomes Massive, which can be found on YouTube. The speakers point out that FINRA CAT, or the Consolidated Audit Trail, was utilized in the Atlas Trading Group investigation. CAT has been operational since March of 2019, and according to FINRA CAT Chief Technology Officer Scott Donaldson, the CAT system brings together all information: every order, originating order, every quote, every route, every cancel, every execution, every partial execution, across everything in the US equities and options markets, including dark pools and ATSs, as well as the exchanges, and from every broker-dealer, whether it be retail, institutional, or proprietary trading. To accomplish this, the CAT runs at gigantic size and scale, consuming over 600 petabytes of storage while it pieces together 400+ billion market events each day. To help you understand just how massive and clearly expensive it has to be to operate the consolidated audit trail, 600 petabytes is the same as 600 million gigabytes. This is the equivalent of about 6.6 million 4K movies, or 120 billion 5 megabyte photos. This is all very important because even though the SEC has access to all of this data, none of it has proven to be worthwhile so far in the criminal case against the Atlas Trading Group. Furthermore, the SEC has been able to point out the price movement in TRCH leading up to the reverse merger, something that can be accomplished with a simple Google search. But they claim that after more than 3 years since the completion of the reverse merger, it's inconclusive as to whether or to what extent the trading volume was attributable to short sellers covering their positions versus defrauded investors purchasing Torchlight stock to burn the shorts or obtain the preferred dividend that they believed was worth $1 to $20. Now, I seem to recall that member firms weren't exactly pleased when they learned that they would be fitting the bill for the consolidated audit trail. How much more will their displeasure be amplified when they learn that it takes more than 3 years to determine if shorts closed their short positions? This is the real issue. The data isn't going to show who bought TRCH based on their own reading of the proxy, a whim, a recommendation from a friend or family member, a PR, a social media post, a recording that put the potential price of the dividend in the $1 to $20 range, or even if it was a combination of any of these. The SEC also conveniently left out that it's inconclusive how many investors held TRCH for multiple years and potentially sold for a profit due to manipulative short sellers that potentially closed their short positions. The aim of the SEC appears to be to put a negative light on the actions of Brenda and Palikaris, but the multi-millions of dollars spent on the consolidated audit trail doesn't even provide data to support to their claims. No, the SEC prefers to make their case based on assumption instead of bringing attention to the truth that the trading data will support. Think about it. If the data shows that there was a significant imbalance leading into the reverse merger, isn't it odd that options in TRCH became available for the first time directly beforehand? And isn't it strange that these OCC memos were distributed to select market participants, informing them that they didn't need to close their short positions until further notice concerning the tradability of a preferred share that was never intended to trade? Also think about the rise to the $11 range just before the reverse merger. If the data shows that most of that can be attributed to household investors buying, for one, it wouldn't be enough to determine why they chose to buy, and two, it means that shorts weren't closing their positions. But if the data were to show that the rise to $11 was due to shorts closing, this wouldn't support the SEC's claim that investors were defrauded. Based on the OCC memos, there was nothing out of the ordinary to expect those that shorted TRCH to either locate the Series A preferred share or to provide some sort of cash settlement. Then, on October 8, 2021, another OCC memo was released to announce that the Series A preferred share became tradable as MMTLP on October 6, 2021, and that they weren't eligible for CNS settlement. According to the memo, the settlement for the MMTLP, part of the options, changed to a broker-to-broker basis for all settlement taking place June 28, 2021, and thereafter. This means that if a buyer wanted to exercise the option, they needed to find a seller directly, instead of going through a central clearinghouse. Then there's this part. in determining that delivery of the MMTLP Series A preferred shares is in fact not possible in respect of a given exercise or assignment, OCC shall require an appropriate officer of the delivering clearing member to represent in writing that delivery is not possible. Upon exercise or assignment of MMAT1 options, OCC will contact each delivering clearing member to provide the specific requirements and procedures for such representation. Pursuant to customary OCC broker-to-broker settlement procedures, inability to effect delivery may subsequently occasion cash settlement as determined by OCC. In other words, if a buyer couldn't get MMTLP shares, the settlement might be delayed or changed to cash settlement, meaning the buyer might get money instead of the shares. By including a contingency for delayed settlement or cash settlement, the OCC appeared to recognise the potential liquidity issue related to locating the MMTLP shares that were already held. Where's the OCC memo that explains the transition from MMTLP to a non-tradable, non-DTC eligible security? Now, in the Fourth OCC Memo, the MMTLP component was subject to broker-to-broker settlement due to the MMTLP shares not being eligible for CNS settlement. However, as of October 12, 2021, MMTLP shares became eligible for settlement at the National Securities Clearing Corporation, NSCC. Therefore, all exercise and assignment activity for the MMTLP component of MMAT1 options from October 12, 2021 and thereafter will no longer be subject to broker-to-broker settlement and will settle through NSCC. There's also a line in all caps at the bottom of this fourth memo that reads as follows: all clearing members are requested to immediately advise all branch offices and correspondents on the above. This was a crucial directive within the memo. The added emphasis clearly demonstrated the importance of disseminating the information to all relevant parties associated with the trading and/or settlement of these options. It is curious, though, that FINRA claims NSCC settlement couldn't have occurred for the trades that took place on December 8, 2022. The presumed reason for this is due to the U3 halt that was initiated before the December 9th trading day could begin. But a community member that spoke with the NSCC says that the NSCC wasn't involved in the settlement and clearance of MMTLP. This, of course, is referring to trading and not options. But it's strange that FINRA makes it sound as if the NSCC was involved the entire time. This calls into question FINRA's ability to keep an accurate account of the FTDs, because without the aid of the NSCC, there's limited oversight, reduced visibility, and an increase in the potential for manipulation. While Hamilton provides extensive coverage dating back to Torchlight, it'll only take 3 paragraphs she wrote about MMTLP to recognise her disdain for MMTLP shareholders that might have anticipated a squeeze, and the obvious effort she took to avoid addressing the MMTLP corporate action beyond the December 12th record date. The paragraphs in question read as follows. Then, on November 21st, 2022, the stock hit a historic high of $11.65. As the December 12th record date neared, the volume increased significantly and the price dropped accordingly. Many preferred stockholders wisely exited their positions before their shares inevitably became worthless. Others held on, having bought into all the hype about a pending short squeeze. As the dividends record date of December 12th approached, calls for a short squeeze only became louder and more widespread, and a huge number of people actually believed that if they held onto their stock for as long as possible before the symbol was deleted and their preferred stock was exchanged for worthless next bridge stock, they would be rich. Some, being inexperienced, didn't seem to even understand that once the dividend took place, they would no longer be able to cash in on their holdings at all. Needless to say, it was complete chaos. Things only got more chaotic when FINRA halted trading in the stock after Thursday, December 8th, one day earlier than people expected, to ensure that there would be no settlement and clearing issues, with the record date being Monday, December 12th. Despite FINRA issuing 3 separate FAQs concerning the MMTLP corporate actions, Hamilton neglects to mention the corporate action itself. This is baffling because the MMTLP corporate actions and the U3 halt are 2 of the main points of contention in the entire MMTLP fiasco. Hamilton doesn't mention the distribution date of the next Bridge Hydrocarbons shares, the share cancellation date, or the overall effective date of the corporate action. However, she does mention the record date of December 12th in all 3 of these paragraphs, but she only does so because it supports the narrative that she's attempting to support. You want to know an even better way to protect investors? You implement a standardized set of criteria for all corporate action submissions. Adherence to these criteria will ensure that the dates specified in each corporate action align with those outlined in any previously disseminated prospectus or press release. Additionally, the information should be presented in a clear, consistent, and unambiguous manner to facilitate an orderly settlement and clearance process. In case you haven't caught on, this is a description of FINRA's Rule 6490, which was implemented in 2010. Hamilton was aware enough of this rule to devote an entire blog post to it in 2018, which is why I believe she purposely chooses to not address the MMTLP corporate actions. Hamilton's narrative suggests that the increase in volume and subsequent price drop leading up to the December 12th record date were primarily due to investors' anticipation of a short squeeze. However, a closer analysis of the daily price activity and volume suggests a different interpretation. Hamilton attributes what she refers to as a historic high on November 21st to social media pumpers luring inexperienced investors. But what she leaves out is that on the previous Friday, November 18th, the SEC made the S1 effective after a 4-month process that included multiple amendments. While I don't doubt that people on social media can contribute to price movement to some degree, the biggest changes in price and volume for MMTLP have occurred in response to regulatory developments. Hamilton weaves this tale about investors being misguided for attempting to hold their shares until the last moment with hopes of getting rich. But the reality is that FINRA's U3 halt robbed them of the opportunity to see if their strategy would be fruitful. Hamilton states, as the dividends record date of December 12th approached, calls for a short squeeze only became louder and more widespread. And a huge number of people actually believed that if they held onto their stock for as long as possible before the symbol was deleted and their preferred stock was exchanged for worthless next bridge stock, they would be rich. This is totally inaccurate for a number of reasons. For one, FINRA didn't introduce the idea of the MMTLP trading symbol being deleted until the revised December 8th corporate action on what became the final day MMTLP traded. She also appears to link the symbol being deleted with the preferred share being exchanged for what she refers to as worthless next bridge stock. But according to both the next Bridge Hydrocarbons November 18th prospectus and the November 23rd Metamaterials PR, the preferred shares were supposed to be exchanged on December 14th, after the close of business. Hamilton has clearly bought into the accuracy of the revised MMTLP corporate action, which included a December 13th symbol deletion date, as well as a 0-hour December 13th effective date. Even though Hamilton composed this blog post many months after these events took place, she fails to incorporate the fact that the actual exchange did occur, or at the very least, the next Bridge Hydrocarbons shares were distributed for the purpose of being exchanged on December 14th. The idea proposed by Hamilton that the MMTLP spin-off was a pump designed to take advantage of investors is irresponsible, especially when you take into account that MMTLP was never intended to trade. The fact that FINRA hasn't been transparent about the broker-dealers involved with making the Series A preferred shares tradable shows that they're protecting the market participants responsible for creating the circumstances by which MMTLP could be allegedly pumped in the first place. Hamilton doesn't bother discussing that FINRA's initial MMTLP FAQ provided insight into FINRA's role in assigning the MMTLP symbol. But because they didn't want to address the complaints from Palikaris that it wasn't supposed to be trading, and that outdated information was used in order to get the symbol assigned, FINRA removed that portion in their revised version of that initial FAQ. It's important to note that the first MMTLP corporate action from FINRA was posted on December 6th. This event, like the S1 being made effective, also resulted in an increase in volume and price for MMTLP. And while Hamilton neglected to mention the corporate actions in the aforementioned blog post, she did mention it in her blog post. Metamaterials MMAT declares Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She doesn't disappoint either. I say that because in the post, she once again shows her ability to do deep dives by providing the Canadian history of Metamaterials, and she also provides a recap including details not included in her previous post about the charges from the SEC. But for some odd reason, 20 months after the U3 halt, she still can't seem to admit that FINRA dropped the ball with the MMTLP corporate actions. This is how she describes what FINRA did. FINRA, as it is supposed to do, filed notice of the corporate action, the exchange of MMTLP for NextBridge stock, on December 6, 2022. It then slightly altered the accompanying note on December 8th and posted that notice as well. What's interesting about this passage of text is that she appears to indicate that FINRA merely filed a notice of the MMTLP corporate action on December 6th, and then on December 8th, slightly altered the accompanying note and posted that as well. In a blog post where she provides nearly the entire history of Torchlight, Metamaterials, and MMTLP, she somehow manages to avoid clearly stating that FINRA created both the initial December 6th MMTLP corporate action and significantly revised the December 8th corporate action, not just slightly altered the accompanying note. This is important because the whole reason FINRA used to justify their U3 halt is that the constraints created by the dates and wording of the corporate actions somehow caught FINRA off guard until just before the December 9th trading day, when some brokerages planned to begin force liquidating short positions. Hamilton continued to refer to the corporate action as a note when she wrote, "The new note read, see daily list of December 6, 2022. Announcement revised. MMTLP shareholders with settled positions as of December 12, 2022 will receive 1 share of NextBridge Hydrocarbons Inc. for every 1 share of MMTLP held. Purchases of MMTLP executed after December 8, £20 to 22 will not receive the distribution. will not be quoted X. Symbol MMTLP will be deleted effective December 13, 2022. While Hamilton would have readers believe that this corporate action represented a slightly altered version of the December 6th corporate action, ask yourself why she didn't include the December 6th corporate action in the blog post. It's because if you were to compare the differences, you'd see that it wasn't just slightly altered. These 6 changes created an entirely different corporate action. 1. The December 8th corporate action begins with See Daily List of December 6, 2022. Announcement revised. FINRA never explained if this meant that investors and brokerages were supposed to rely on both corporate actions, or if the December 8th corporate action invalidated the information in the first. Even after the U3 halt, brokerages communicated to their clients information like the December 13th share cancellation date, which was only included in the December 6th corporate action. This was very confusing, but obviously not worth mentioning from Hamilton's point of view. 2. The record date terminology is no longer included. Both corporate actions indicated that positions in MMTLP needed to be settled by December 12, 2022. This was sufficient enough to convey that December 12th was the record date, but we can all agree that by removing the terminology, the revised corporate action provided less clarity. 3. There's no longer any mention of the December 14th pay/distribution date. Why did FINRA remove so much pertinent information in the guise of adding clarity? 4. The December 6th corporate action indicated that shares of MMTLP needed to be held on the December 14th pay/distribution date. This corporate action merely states that shares need to be held. This was clearly an area of concern on the initial corporate action, because how could anyone be holding shares of MMTLP on December 14th if the shares were cancelled on December 13th? 5. There's no share cancellation date. The December 6th corporate action included a December 13th share cancellation date, a date that didn't match the next Bridge Hydrocarbons prospectus, nor the November 23rd PR from Metamaterials that FINRA claimed to have used to make the corporate actions consistent. This is one of the biggest issues, because by changing share cancellation from December 14th after market close to the 0 hour of December 13th, FINRA removed 2 full settlement days that could have been incorporated in some way. 6. The December 8th corporate action now included a December 13th symbol deletion date. What you've just observed does not fit into the category of slightly altered. The changes FINRA made were significant. So much so that due to the removal of the share cancellation date, the pay/distribution date, and by making sure that the overall effective date corresponded to the date and time that the MMTLP symbol was to be deleted, rather than the actual exchange, FINRA's MMTLP corporate actions were in violation of SEA Rule 10b-17. While Hamilton avoids mentioning the MMTLP corporate actions, it's clear that there were inconsistencies and potential confusion surrounding the corporate action. FINRA's initial corporate action included a December 13th share cancellation date, which conflicted with the December 14th cancellation date mentioned in both the Next Bridge Hydrocarbons prospectus and Metamaterials PR. Furthermore, FINRA's inclusion of symbol deletion in the December 8th revised corporate action didn't add clarity as FINRA claimed. The OTC market's caveat emptor designation for MMTLP on December 8th further highlights the confusion surrounding the corporate actions. Because why else, after 14 months of trading, would they label it caveat emptor? They mentioned potential confusion related to the corporate actions. December 8th is when FINRA posted the revised corporate action created by FINRA. Then, on this same day, caveat emptor. The confusion and inconsistencies continue because exactly 8 months after FINRA revised the MMTLP corporate action, Brenda Hamilton posted her SEC Enforcement Issues Wells Notices for Metamaterials Execs blog. This was about 5 months after the initial MMTLP FAQ from FINRA. This is what Brenda Hamilton says about the first FAQ. Finally, on March 16, 2023, FINRA published a FAQ about the corporate action and trading halt, saying with great restraint that it had received a number of questions about the matter. The FAQ is well worth reading. The regulator's explanation of events and of its own decisions are sane and convincing. The way Hamilton refers to investors that held MMTLP, it's no secret that she doesn't think highly of them. So when she calls FINRA's FAQ sane and convincing, I get the sense that she's also calling MMTLP holders insane and unconvincing. But here's the part that's really insane, and keep in mind that Hamilton said that the FAQ is well worth the reading. She says this a couple of paragraphs above. What's important about FINRA's explanation is that the regulator had deemed that there might be problems with settlement and clearing of stock sold too close to the Monday close, when the MMTLP stock was to be cancelled. Unfortunately, shareholders did not and do not wish to understand that. The Monday she's referencing here is December 12, 2022. By saying that MMTLP was to be cancelled as of the Monday close, she's obviously referring to the 0 hour of December 13th, meaning the first second after December 12th, the shares would be cancelled. It's important to understand what Hamilton is saying here. She's pointing out that FINRA's explanation for the U3 halt of MMTLP was based on settlement concerns in relation to the MMTLP shares being cancelled at the close of the December 12th trading day. But the MMTLP share cancellation date wasn't December 13th, it was December 14th, after market close. FINRA made this clear multiple times in their March 16, 2023 FAQ. The MMTLP shares were cancelled on December 14th. So let's try to understand what happened here. On November 18, 2022, Bridge Hydrocarbons included dates in their prospectus. Those dates included a December 14th effective date of the spin-off, after which the preferred stock of Metamaterials would be cancelled. Consistent with this, on November 23rd, Metamaterials released a PR stating that the shares of Bridge common stock will be distributed on December 14, 2022, after the close of the trading markets, at which time all of the shares of Series A preferred stock will be automatically cancelled. Now, jumping ahead to March 16, 2023, to the FINRA FAQ that Hamilton says is well worth reading. It states, after several amendments, the registration statement for the Bridge shares became effective on November 18, 2022. On November 23, 2022, Metamaterials issued an announcement regarding the Bridge MMTLP corporate action. These are the two documents we just looked at that showed the December 14th after market close MMTLP share cancellation date. Now the very next sentence in FINRA's FAQ says, Metamaterials also stated that the Bridge shares would be distributed to MMTLP shareholders on December 14, 2022, at which time all MMTLP shares would be automatically cancelled. and MMTLP holders would cease to have any rights with respect to those shares. FINRA's FAQ goes on to say, FINRA created the MMTLP corporate actions consistent with the information provided by Metamaterials and the November 23 PR. George Palikaris corroborated this under oath when he stated, FINRA provided the language for the initial corporate action and unilaterally revised the language for the second MMTLP corporate action that was posted on December 8. FINRA only included share cancellation in the initial December 6th corporate action. The date FINRA used was December 13th. 3 months later, according to Hamilton, FINRA provides a sane and convincing explanation of their actions, but they lied. They said they created the MMTLP corporate actions to be consistent with the information provided by Metamaterials. But the introduction of the December 13th share cancellation came from FINRA. In case it isn't clear enough, FINRA also put it this way in their FAQ. The MMTLP shares were cancelled by the issuer on December 14th, and therefore it has not been possible to trade them since that time, irrespective of the halt status displayed on FINRA's website. And when you click Cancelled in that sentence, it takes you to the Certificate of Withdrawal of Certificate of Designation for the Series A preferred stock, which became effective on December 14th, at a time that corresponds to after-market close. So given that Brenda Hamilton's Wells Notice blog post was published 5 months after the FINRA FAQ referenced, it's a bit insane and unconvincing that she contradicts FINRA and the issuers by using the incorrect share cancellation date from the initial MMTLP corporate action. What Hamilton demonstrates here is that the incorrect 0-hour December 13th share cancellation date provides for 2 less settlement days and makes it easier to sell the lie that shareholders did not and do not wish to understand. But when you incorporate the real December 14th share cancellation date, and when you take the time to adhere to FINRA's Rule 6490, accounting for any potential issues related to settlement and clearance before posting the corporate action, then we could have avoided the current settlement issue that we've been experiencing for over 700 days. The fact that FINRA U3 halted MMTLP to prevent an issue related to settlement and clearance, that FINRA created by forcing Metamaterials to use the corporate actions created by FINRA and then revised unilaterally is completely insane. And this is without taking into account the communication between the SEC and FINRA before they posted the first MMTLP corporate action. Hamilton provided a link in her Metamaterials Declares Bankruptcy blog post to the July 15, 2022 version of the next Bridge Hydrocarbons prospectus, the one that was yet to include dates. This is the same thing that FINRA did in their December 9, 2022 UPC halt notice. The difference here is that the halt notice was about 3 weeks after the November 18th prospectus. Hamilton was using the same tactic that FINRA used, but this time she was doing so 20 months afterwards. The November 18th Next Bridge Hydrocarbons prospectus, the one that came out once it was made effective by the SEC, included the information pertaining to the spin-off becoming effective after market close on December 14th. This same prospectus indicated that MMTLP share cancellation would take place immediately after the spin-off. This informed the reader that December 14th, after market close, was both the effective date of the spin-off and the share cancellation date. Miraculously, neither MMTLP corporate action included a December 14th effective date, nor a December 14th share cancellation date. So it's obvious, based on the way FINRA hijacked the MMTLP corporate action to include a December 13th date, If FINRA would have linked to the prospectus that included the correct December 14th date, it wouldn't have helped their attempt to conflate the trading symbol being deleted on December the 13th, with the MMTLP shares being cancelled. The fact that Hamilton links to the version of the prospectus that she linked to is even more suspicious when you take notice of what's written in red. In a bright red, impossible-to-miss font, right before the portion of the prospectus that Hamilton quotes, it reads as follows: "The information in this prospectus is not complete and may be changed. We may not issue these securities until the registration statement filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission is effective. This prospectus is not an offer to sell these securities, and it is not soliciting an offer to buy these securities in any jurisdiction where the offer or sale is not permitted." Then, in all red and in all caps, it says, "Subject to completion, dated July 15, 2022. Hamilton then quoted the paragraph directly below the red text. But we're supposed to believe that she put zero effort into locating the November 18th version that was made effective. It's almost as if FINRA and Hamilton were both trying to prevent people from recognising that the dates in FINRA's MMTLP corporate actions didn't match what the issuer originally disclosed to the public. Still, in the Wells Notice blog post, under a section titled FINRA Responds, Hamilton wrote the following: "In social media, the SEC and FINRA were accused of manipulating MMTLP, which was seen as a signifier of the corruption of government agencies. FINRA is not a government agency, but many believe it is. Shareholders, now shareholders in the non-trading Next Bridge, filed a FOIA request and learned that employees of FINRA and the SEC communicate with each other, and found it to be shocking proof of the extent of their grift. Now, as we go into the exact content of the FOIA thread, please remind yourself that Hamilton completely disregards this as shareholders merely learning that the SEC and FINRA communicate with one another. Once again, she insults the intelligence of investors, while also seemingly attempting to inform the reader that there's nothing to see in the FOIA thread. That is except for the part about the alleged threats aimed at FINRA. More on this later. The earliest email in the thread is dated November 29, 2021. This was close to 2 months after MMTLP became tradable. The email is from Sam Draddy, FINRA's Senior Vice President, National Cause and Financial Crimes Detections Programs, Market Investigations Team, and the message was directed to 3 redacted SEC email addresses and Patricia Casamates, FINRA's Vice President of Market Operations. The subject was Inquiry, and the message appears to be about Draddy letting someone at the SEC know that it was Casamates from Market Ops that reached out to a redacted name at the SEC. Some of the responsibilities of FINRA's Market Operations Department are monitoring trading activity for signs of misconduct, manipulation, or other irregularities, ensuring that trades are settled in a timely and accurate manner, and ensuring that member firms comply with FINRA rules and regulations related to trading. I won't pretend to know why Casamates was reaching out to the SEC, but every other email in the thread is related to MMTLP and/or MMAT, and Casamates was also known to have managed OTC corporate action and dividend announcements. Many of the Rule 6490 deficiency notices online came directly from Casamates. The next email is dated December 2nd, 2022. This was 4 days before the first MMTLP corporate action. This email is from Richard Boyle, FINRA's Assistant Director of their Fraud Department in Washington, D.C. The message was to a redacted SEC contact, and CC'd was Jay Gibbon, a principal investigator out of FINRA's Rockville, Maryland office. The subject of this message was Metamaterials Inc., MMAT and MMTLP, next Bridge Hydrocarbons Inc. Boyle lets the SEC contact know that he's aware of the communications between the contact and FINRA's OTC Corporate Actions team regarding the issuer in the subject line and their proposed spin-off transaction. He asked the contact if anyone would be available to discuss the matter on Monday or Tuesday, which would have been December 5th or 6th, since this was a Friday. He went on to say, FINRA's Market Fraud Investigations team recently received several tips that appear to have also been sent to the SEC. Below are some proposed times to discuss, but we can work around your schedules if these don't work for you. From this email, we see that multiple FINRA departments, including the Corporate Actions team, were aware of potential issues with the MMTLP spin-off, at least 4 days before posting the first MMTLP corporate action. On Monday, December 5th, 2022, Sam Draddy sent an email to what appears to be at least 3 redacted SEC contacts, and he also CC'd FINRA's Boyle and Gibbon. The subject is Inquiry, the same as from the November 2021 email that was about Patricia Casamates being in contact with someone at the SEC. The content in this message should rule out any ideas that the 2021 email wasn't related to MMTLP. It reads as follows. Redacted looks like this MMTLP matter has now hit my fraud team's radar screen, and seemingly a lot of other radar screens as well. I know you have spoken to Patty Casamates and our General Counsel's office, but was wondering if it made sense for my fraud team to have a conversation directly with you and your folks working on the matter, so we are not duplicating efforts. We are looking at the 2 issuers from a fraud/manipulation angle, and in fact, blue sheeting both MMAT and MMTLP as we speak. If you think a comparison of notes is worth a quick call, let me know a good day/time. I can set up a Zoom, and feel free to let me know if redacted or anyone else should be included. So from this December 5th email, we see that Sam Draddy appears to communicate to contacts at the SEC that the situation that they were clearly already aware of has now hit the radars of multiple departments within FINRA. It also doesn't help matters from FINRA's perspective that they were investigating the issuers for fraud and/or manipulation, because by posting the corporate action the very next day, they're basically saying that they completed 2 separate blue sheet investigations in less than 24 hours and determined that there was nothing found that should have prevented them from posting the corporate action. By now, you can see why someone like Brenda Hamilton, who has written all of these blog posts, cheering on FINRA and belittling investors, wouldn't want to include the messages from the FOIA Thread. She, of all people, would know that the investigation that Draddy initiated on December 5th, as well as the pending SEC case against Breda, Palicaris and Metamaterials, were both reasons, according to FINRA's Rule 6490, for FINRA to deem the MMTLP corporate action submission deficient. All of these messages in the FOIA thread, showing that so many eyes from both the SEC and FINRA were looking into the matter, should make you wonder how it is that FINRA could mess up on 2 MMTLP corporate actions and then pretend to discover an issue right before multiple brokerages planned to begin force liquidating short positions. Now, the one email from the FOIA thread that Hamilton references is the one that attempted to put a negative light on the investors impacted by the U3 halt. This message was sent from Robert W. Cook, CEO of FINRA, and it most likely went to Gary Gensler of the SEC. In the message, on a Sunday night, Cook explains that he's already told the staff of all FINRA offices not to come into work due to complaints and alleged threats aimed at FINRA employees. First and foremost, there's no one person that can speak for the entire community, but if there was a person threatening to harm FINRA employees, then address it appropriately. Let it be a deterrent for anyone else, because we don't need that kind of negative attention. Second, on December 11th, many of us still believed there was a chance that trading in MMTLP would resume at some point. Not saying that it's impossible that someone could have sent a threat, but in my opinion, I would think that threats would be more common in the more than 2 years since the U3 halt of MMTLP. Third, there's a smaller community that appears to be opposed to the greater MMTLP community getting a favourable resolution. They mock us, they attempt to counter our efforts, and they do so almost as if they were getting paid to do so. They've shown that there are no levels too low for them to stoop. Fourth, FINRA forced Metamaterials to go with a flawed corporate action that was created by FINRA. FINRA hid the fact that they've been discussing the MMTLP situation with the SEC since around the time MMTLP became tradable. They hid their investigation into MMAT and MMTLP that began just 1 day before they posted the first MMTLP corporate action, and 11 months after the halt, when they put out their supplemental FAQ, they claimed that the existing short interest was approximately 2.65 million, a figure that, according to Bridge Hydrocarbons, is only a fraction of what one representative of a firm has requested in order to fix their imbalance. I mention all of this because FINRA lacks credibility. If you disagree, then just consider the fact that FINRA could have voluntarily agreed to show a judge the MMTLP CAT data and blue sheets in any number of the MMTLP-related lawsuits they've fought to prove that they've been truthful and to protect their employees from the threats that they claim have been sent their way. But they haven't. All FINRA employees should be asking themselves, why would FINRA hide the truth of their innocence if it meant potentially putting every FINRA employee at risk? And finally, it should be noted that in Hamilton's Wells Notice blog, she makes it seem like the FOIA request was granted and the email thread was publicly shared before FINRA put out their initial March 16, 2023 FAQ. This is false. The FOIA thread was made public April 1st, £20.23. FINRA gave off the appearance that their FAQ was an example of being transparent, but they left out so much information in the same way that Hamilton leaves out the FOIA thread in her blog posts. While social media might have played a role in promoting the idea of a squeeze to some investors, it isn't illegal to invest to take part in a squeeze. Nor is it anyone's business why a person decided to invest in the first place. Inadvertently, by FINRA asking investors that called their offices if that was their expectation, they brought validity to the idea that a squeeze was clearly going to occur if they didn't U3 halt trading. And if anyone deserves to be on trial for promoting the idea of a squeeze, it's the brokerages that read the MMTLP corporate action, and then informed their clients that there'd be forced liquidations and/or position close only trading beginning on December 9th, the day that FINRA, coincidentally, U3 halted trading, lasting until December 13th. You see, the SEC makes the assumption that every investor was on social media, but it's not an assumption to say that every brokerage had the ability to communicate directly to their clients. But there's more. Is it more logical that investors would take advice from a random social media post or YouTube channel? Or is it more logical that they'd take the advice of the VP of the market where their security traded, and an experienced online TV host that has featured that VP on his show multiple times? when the then VP of OTC Markets, Jeff Mandell, and Trader TV live host Brendan Wickens appeared on their December 7, 2022 broadcast. They discussed the MMTLP corporate action, and based on their understanding, they told the over 400,000 Trader TV live subscribers and the many thousands of non-subscribers that investors had until December 12th to trade MMTLP, and that they should expect volatility. Ross Mandell is the former CEO of Sky Capital. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for conspiracy, securities fraud, wire fraud, and mail fraud. According to the indictment, from 1998 to 2006, Mandell and his co-conspirators made material misrepresentations and omissions to get investors to invest in Thornwater and Sky Capital-related private placements. They then used the money raised from investors for their own personal gain, including excessive, undisclosed commissions to brokers and paying off victims that lost money from prior investment opportunities. From the scheme, Mandell and his co-conspirators raised more than $50 million from defrauded investors. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because Brenda Hamilton has written at least 3 blog posts about Ross Mandell's legal battle and eventual release from prison. When you read the way Hamilton writes about Mandell's story, she does so in a way that doesn't dismiss the arguments Mandell makes about how he wasn't given a fair trial. Upon his release, Hamilton gushes about Mandell and promotes his website, biography, podcast, and social media activity. In comparison, John Berda and George Palikaras are merely facing allegations of formulating a scheme. None of the allegations have been proven, and there have been no convictions, but Hamilton writes about them as though they've already been found guilty. The same can be said about the way she writes about the MMTLP community. She's 100% convinced that FINRA and the SEC are incapable of misleading investors and issuers. There's no need for due process, and any piece of evidence that doesn't fit this narrative is either glossed over or misrepresented. This is incredibly troubling because it gives the impression that Hamilton has been given a directive in which to write her MMTLP-related blog posts. This is especially evident when you consider that in Mandell's appeal, she points out that all of the several FOIA requests made by Mandell were denied for no specific reason. This led to Mandell suing the SEC, the FBI, and the DOJ because he believed they were withholding information that could have helped to overturn his conviction. This bit of information makes it seem like there actually was more to Mandell's case. But a MMTLP community member learned from a FOIA response that from December 9, 2022 to July 21, 2023, there were approximately 10.6 gigabytes of data, the equivalent of 636,000 pages of emails that appeared to fit the specified requested query related to Metamaterials and Torchlight. To date, there's only been one granted MMTLP FOIA request, and it was only a handful of pages. Imagine the amount of information that's being withheld in those 636,000 pages. But also imagine how much more information is floating around outside of the search constraints of this particular FOIA request. For the average reader, her argument makes sense. But for anyone with knowledge of the actual SEC and FINRA rules that Hamilton avoids addressing in detail, it's clear that the truth is being hidden in exchange for attempting to make the CEOs appear guilty, and to make the investors/holders of MMTLP appear uneducated and/or misguided. This isn't the first time we've seen this. Ever since shortly after the U3 halt, There have been a variety of sources that have tried to do the same thing that Hamilton appears to do here. Georgetown professor James Angel claimed to be a Torchlight/MMTLP investor, but he immediately used his platform to point the blame at the issuer and defending FINRA. He even went so far as to present an erroneous PowerPoint presentation to congressional staffers to counter the efforts of the MMTLP community that travelled to Washington, D.C. Strangely, though there was plenty of room, Angel failed to disclose his affiliation with Modern Markets Initiative on the PowerPoint slide that proudly displayed his other affiliations. James Angel has since crawled into a hole after the MMTLP community discovered that his program at Georgetown is closely associated with FINRA, that his patents related to dark pools seemingly aid manipulation in the market, and that he's been employed by Modern Markets Initiative, a now defunct high-frequency trading lobbyist organization that was co-founded by Ari Rubenstein, the CEO of GTS Securities, the market maker linked to the earliest and final trades in MMTLP. Rubenstein has also cited Angel in comment letters. MMTLP wasn't the first time that Angel somewhat covertly came to Rubenstein's aid when there were accusations of manipulation on behalf of GTS Securities. Not long before the MMTLP fiasco, Overstock's dividend also traded on the OTC without the permission of the issuer. When Overstock complained, and their legal team contacted firms like GTS to get them to stop, Ari Rubenstein complained, and James Angel again pretended to be a concerned Overstock shareholder that for some reason echoed the sentiments of Ari Rubenstein in the same article. FINRA then stepped in and allowed Ari Rubenstein and GTS to continue, likely because at this time he was already a member of FINRA's Market Surveillance Advisory Group. One key difference between the Overstock and MMTLP situations is the utilization of social media, primarily the X platform, which has allowed investors to mobilize and to be heard. While Ari Rubenstein disappeared from social media just weeks before the U3 halt, his presence was felt to some degree, almost like he deployed his assets behind the scenes, not expecting that people would be able to easily see how they all link back to him. Alexander Osipovich, a Wall Street Journal contributor, betrayed the trust of the MMTLP community when he interviewed a handful of MMTLP investors, but used their stories to produce an inaccurate portrayal of the MMTLP fiasco. Similar to James Angel, the MMTLP community discovered that Osipovich has had his articles hosted on the GTS Securities website, that Ari Rubenstein has cited his work in comment letters, and that Osipovich has promoted the GTS Securities venture with Jukebox, spelled JKBX, a platform that allows investors to invest in music royalties, a platform that has had zero delays in getting their S1 made effective, and has also seemingly distanced themselves from mentioning their relationship with GTS Securities. Brandon Kotkadin of Forbes is another writer that has had multiple negative interactions with the MMTLP community. He's most known for creating Forbes' first and only graphic cartoon. This cartoon took 6 months to create and used inaccurate information to poke fun of the MMTLP community and to speak negatively of the companies involved. Just like Angel and Osipovich, Kotkadin can be linked to Ari Rubenstein because JJ Kinahan, a senior contributor at Forbes, is also an advisor for Clearlist, which is a company that was started by Ari Rubenstein. Kinahan has also been linked to Kirsten Wegner, whom was the CEO of Rubenstein's Modern Markets Initiative. Douglas Sifu, CEO of Virtue Financial, has had numerous negative exchanges with the MMTLP community on social media. The MMTLP community discovered that he wasn't truthful when he claimed that his company had no exposure to trading MMTLP. And Sifu is linked to Ari Rubenstein because Sifu's Virtue made a strategic investment in Clearlist. Charles Gasparino of Fox Business has been a vocal antagonizer of multiple stock communities on social media. He was late joining the MMTLP investor hate party, but he really hit the ground running. The narrative pushed by Gasparino was that investors didn't know how to read the company's press releases. But what Gasparino fails to understand is that the press releases he references were produced by the company after FINRA posted each corporate action, not in conjunction. The press releases informed investors of what FINRA did, and even included a disclaimer that informed the reader that the dates and disclosures from FINRA superseded what the company already made public the month prior. A detailed explanation of this can be found in the video MMTLP, FINRA's Deception, Gasparino's Folly. It's less than 10 minutes long, and it can also be found on YouTube. Charles Gasparino can be linked to Ari Rubenstein because the two were mentioned together at the 2022 Milken Institute conference, one of Rubenstein's last appearances before disappearing from the public eye. Gasparino has also been on a panel at another Milken Institute conference with Kirsten Wegner, the then CEO of Rubenstein's Modern Markets Initiative. Also, the former acting chair of the SEC, Michael Piwawar, has long been an executive vice president at the Milken Institute, for nearly as long as he's been an advisor for Rubenstein's GTS Securities, as well as an interviewee for Kirsten Wegner on Modern Markets Initiative. Of all of the names mentioned, specifically the ones that have a history of speaking negatively about MMTLP, the MMTLP community, and/or the issuers involved, isn't it interesting that there's always a way that they're linked to Ari Rubenstein, the CEO of GTS Securities, co-founder and chairman of Clearlist, and co-founder of Modern Markets Initiative? Also, given that there's been a 10-minute video, MMTLP, the red flags ignored by the SEC, that points out these conflicts of interest, and even a 2-hour video, How and Why FINRA Manipulated the MMTLP Corporate Actions Part 3. You'd think that greater effort would go into finding MMTLP detractors that can't be linked to Ari Rubenstein. So the fact that there isn't an obvious link between Hamilton's blogs and Ari Rubenstein, it isn't a surprise. If anything, it's a sign that if there was coordination between Ari Rubenstein or someone close to him to encourage this type of MMTLP slander, it appears they've finally learned how to solicit the services of someone that can't be linked back to him. Yet. There has been zero transparency from FINRA and the SEC. No blue sheet data has been provided, even though, according to Sam Draddy, FINRA began blue sheeting both MMAT and MMTLP on December 5, 2022, a day before FINRA posted the first MMTLP corporate action. No CAT trading data has been provided, even though, according to FINRA CAT's Scott Donaldson, the CAT data was instrumental in the investigation into the Atlas Trading Group that allegedly pumped and dumped TRCH. According to Donaldson, FINRA CAT tracks every transaction. By their own admission, they have been watching since TRCH. So, are we supposed to believe they stopped watching after the reverse merger that resulted in MMAT and the Series A preferred share that later became tradable as MMTLP? FINRA has misrepresented its ability to conduct an audit. Their Rule 4140 states that they are perfectly capable of doing so, and even if international brokerages were outside of their jurisdiction, Why wouldn't FINRA audit the brokerages that are clearly under their jurisdiction as a sign of good faith? The impression is that the subsequent regulatory efforts that FINRA referred to in their November 6, 2023 supplemental FAQ was FINRA's description of performing some sort of audit. However, the result, as mentioned earlier, was an estimated 2.65 million shares of short interest. FINRA downplayed the severity of the issue by presenting such a small estimate, but, if you recall, Bridge Hydrocarbons informed FINRA that they had been approached by a single entity requesting significantly more than what FINRA estimated. Every version of FINRA's FAQ is filled with lies and inconsistencies, cleverly worded but easy to see through. FINRA and Robert W. Cook have cited these FAQs in lawsuits and in responses to Congress, but they have never shown concrete data to support their assertions. There is also the matter of the FINRA meetings with Gary Gensler after MMTLP became Tradeable. Before MMTLP, these meetings appear to have consisted of only Robert W. Cook, or Robert W. Cook and Robert Colby of FINRA. After MMTLP became Tradeable, these meetings grew to include multiple high-level FINRA executives who had never been associated with these meetings with Gary Gensler. According to Gary Gensler's public calendar, these meetings occurred periodically, and there were at least 2 other meetings with Gensler's staff that did not appear on his public calendar. Of all the FINRA departments represented at these meetings, noticeably absent was anyone from FINRA's Enforcement Department. Then, just over a month after the U3 halt of MMTLP, FINRA announced that Jessica Hopper, FINRA's then head of enforcement, would be leaving FINRA in just over a week after the notice on February 3rd. FINRA's first MMTLP FAQ was released more than a month after Hopper's departure on March 16th, so the impression is that Jessica Hopper chose not to be a party to the way FINRA planned to respond. Or, if this is a reach, maybe it is more believable that after 18 years with FINRA, Hopper just decided to leave without even 2 weeks' notice, for no particular reason. You know what adds to the theory of Hopper purposely being excluded from the FINRA meetings with Gary Gensler? Look no further than June of 2021, when Hopper levied FINRA's largest fine ever against Robinhood. Hopper is quoted, "The fine imposed in this matter, the highest ever levied by FINRA, reflects the scope and seriousness of Robinhood's violations, including FINRA's finding that Robinhood communicated false and misleading information to millions of its customers." Ask yourself, how can Hopper 1 year earlier fine Robinhood $70 million for trading outages and misleading customers, but then play along with FINRA's attempt to justify misleading investors by hijacking the MMTLP corporate actions, taking away their choice to either sell or hold their investment, otherwise known as a permanent outage, and Hopper was not an isolated incident. Christopher Kelly became acting head of enforcement upon Hopper's departure. By August of that same year, FINRA announced that Bill St. Louis would become FINRA's new head of enforcement. But on October 31st, FINRA announced that Kelly would be leaving FINRA the following day. Why, after 9 years with FINRA, was his departure so abrupt? Similar to the situation with Hopper, FINRA released their supplemental FAQ for MMTLP just 5 days after Kelly's departure. The appearance here is that Kelly, like Hopper, probably did not agree with FINRA's direction, and, by leaving before the release of the FAQ, it would be easier to separate himself from any potential blowback. And, if this was not enough, a third person from FINRA Enforcement, Lisa M. Colon, also left FINRA at the same time as Kelly. Hopper ended up at Edward Jones, working remotely, Kelly and Cologne both joined Chiesa, Shahinian, and Giantomasi. Supporting this theory, Kelly and Cologne are now critics of FINRA's methods of regulation by enforcement. Recognizing the moves within enforcement is one way to understand what really occurred. Even Gerbir Gruel, the SEC's head of enforcement, stepped down in October of 2024. He was linked to a bit of controversy himself, but it is common practice for FINRA's head of enforcement department to communicate with their SEC counterparts. This would mean that Gruel's last communications were likely with Bill St. Louis. St. Louis proudly boasted that FINRA recently fined Apex for lending customer securities without their permission and without paying commissions, the first fine of its kind, even though the rule has been in existence for at least a decade. Apex handled clearing for a number of brokerages whose clients held MMTLP. Most, if not all, of these brokerages did not allow new buys in MMTLP when it became tradable. This means that, if their clients were holding MMTLP, it was because they received the shares as a result of holding TRCH through the reverse merger. Brokerages that cleared through Apex rarely made it easy for their clients to transfer their MMTLP shares to the transfer agent. Whether it was extremely high fees, agents telling clients transfers were not possible, or only being allowed to transfer within a certain window, it was always questionable that Apex made it so difficult to facilitate transfers, especially since these brokerages never allowed MMTLP to be purchased on their platforms. Here is where it all comes full circle. In Intercoastal Waterways versus TradeStation, a case where FINRA was once listed as a nominal defendant, one of the claims is that TradeStation was also lending securities, specifically MMTLP, without obtaining permission from their clients. This likely contributed to TradeStation's admission that they could no longer facilitate transfers to the transfer agent. So, given that FINRA is fully aware of this case, why is it that Apex Clearing is the first recipient of this fine? Doesn't it seem that FINRA is protecting TradeStation and themselves by not investigating TradeStation's actions as they relate to the lending of MMTLP without client permission? These are the kinds of questions you would ask if your true purpose was to get to the truth of what occurred in the case of MMTLP. This is just a fraction of the subject matter that Brenda Hamilton neglected to cover. The glaring issues with Hamilton's coverage of Torchlight, Metamaterials, and MMTLP are that she seems to be intent on convincing her reader that the investors lack intelligence and that the former CEOs are to blame for manipulative schemes that somehow went undetected or unenforced by the regulators until it was already too late. The easiest way to recognise this is to do what both Hamilton, FINRA, and the SEC have failed to do, and that's to literally look at the rules like FINRA's Rule 6490 and the other rules mentioned, and see for yourself that FINRA just didn't follow the appropriate procedures. The same can be said about the peculiar activity related to the multiple OCC memos, and the ignored complaints from the issuer when MMTLP initially became tradable. Another issue that points to Hamilton's bias is that she neglected to write anything concerning the case against TradeStation and their admission to being imbalanced in MMTLP, which made them unable to fulfill transfer requests to the transfer agent. This is especially confusing since Hamilton has a history of working with the attorney on the case, Mark Basil, and his law firm. It's also concerning that Mark hasn't protested the way Hamilton frames the events in a way that contradicts what he presents in his lawsuit. The sworn statement from George Palikaras, submitted in the TradeStation case, provided information that reinforces what the MMTLP community has been saying for more than a year, And the same can be said about the correspondences from next Bridge Hydrocarbons to FINRA, and the multiple interviews by John Berder since shortly after the U3 halt. And while some investors potentially lost upwards of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, on MMAT due to the alleged mismanagement or self-sabotage at the hands of the Metamaterials Board of Directors that ousted Palikaris from his company, Hamilton nor the SEC have bothered to investigate the questionable moves, such as allowing patents to expire, firing critical staff, selling assets at bargain basement prices, ceasing to pay leases, enacting reverse splits, refusing capitalization opportunities presented from Palikaris, and filing for bankruptcy while still getting paid salaries and bonuses that they did nothing to earn. Then, when you factor in the fact that Metamaterials was very likely the victim of the same type of manipulation that plagued Torchlight, it makes sense that the stock price suffered from a constant decline when there were numerous positive developments after the reverse merger, leading up to the opening of their state-of-the-art facility. But how do we know that MMAT was manipulated? Because Wes Christian was hired to investigate, and if he didn't find anything, the bankruptcy trustee wouldn't have seen a reason to continue requesting his services. Another interesting aspect of Wes Christian's investigation is that even though he was able to get data concerning MMAT, he was unable to retrieve data about MMTLP from the DTCC or from Broadridge, as they didn't want to cooperate. This was just another gigantic red flag that Hamilton somehow neglected to include in her coverage. If a securities attorney publishes blogs that misinform the reader, especially with a biased or misleading perspective, there could and should be various repercussions based on the severity of the misinformation and its potential impact. Attorneys are held to strict ethical standards, including obligations to uphold honesty and fairness. If a securities attorney deliberately spreads misinformation in a professional context, they could be violating ethical rules set by the Bar Association in their jurisdiction. Providing biased or incorrect legal analysis, especially in matters involving public markets and securities, could be viewed as damaging the integrity of the legal profession or the broader financial markets. If the blog post influences readers' understanding or actions regarding securities, there may be grounds for a complaint. If the attorney's blog violates professional rules, such as spreading misinformation or making misleading statements, they could face disciplinary action by their state bar. Consequences could range from reprimand to suspension or disbarment, depending on the severity. The state bar is typically the best authority to handle complaints regarding attorney conduct. If the attorney's blogs violate ethical rules, such as spreading misinformation or failing to provide impartial legal commentary, a complaint can be filed with the attorney's state bar. After gathering evidence and consulting other sources to verify the bias or misinformation, you can proceed to file a formal complaint with the appropriate authority. For an ethics violation, you would typically file with the state bar, while for securities-related issues, the SEC would be involved. Depending on the person telling the story, be it FINRA, Brenda Hamilton, or a random person on YouTube creating videos, there's always a possibility of bias. But when you can closely examine what they're saying, especially in context to the rules on the books, the evidence, and the actual events that took place, then the truth will always come to light. Here's what the MMTLP fiasco likely boils down to. The SEC doesn't like short squeezes. We know this from multiple sources, including former Overstock CEO Patrick Byrne. Based on the proposed penalty, the SEC wants to make sure that George Palikaris and John Berda can never be CEOs of publicly traded companies because of their alleged scheme. But the market participants that pay membership fees to FINRA are allowed to repeatedly commit actual crimes that harm investors. Yet, they only have to pay small fines without ever having to admit or deny wrongdoing. From the SEC charges against the former CEOs, we know that the SEC considered the reverse merger between Torchlight and Metamaterials to be a scheme to punish short sellers. So, if the SEC doesn't like short squeezes, and the SEC has oversight over the Options Clearing Corporation, does it sound far-fetched that the SEC could have used their influence on the OCC to ensure that short sellers didn't have to close their short positions? I know this sounds crazy, but it was shortly after the events of the OCC paving the way for MMTLP to become tradable that the SEC and FINRA began communications concerning MMTLP. Then, shortly before the first MMTLP corporate action, the SEC was in contact with FINRA's OTC corporate actions team about MMTLP. Isn't it strange that the SEC would be in contact with the same corporate action team that would eventually be involved with breaking FINRA's Rule 6490, changing the MMTLP corporate actions, and forcing the issuers to go along with it? FINRA's U3 halt of MMTLP likely prevented a short squeeze in the same way as the OCC memos. But let's say that there wouldn't have been a short squeeze. The OCC memos and the U3 halt prevented settlement from taking place, the very role that the regulators are in place to facilitate. Why didn't FINRA work with the issuer sometime between the halt and the alleged deletion of the trading symbol to adjust the dates? Why did FINRA allow so much shorting to take place on December 8th? The SEC, being the puppet master the whole time, would explain why FINRA is so comfortable with breaking their rules, lying in their FAQs and responses to Congress, and hiding behind their immunity in every legal proceeding. Gary Gensler said that the SEC's FSIO regularly provides FINRA oversight to ensure that they're following their own rules. But of course the SEC would never hold FINRA accountable for the rules that they instructed them to break. Evidence of this can be found in the latest United States Government Accountability Office review of the SEC's oversight of FINRA. USGAO, in November 2024, released the public version of their report concerning the SEC's oversight of FINRA. Covering 2021 to 2023, the years MMTLP became tradable without the issuer's consent, and FINRA's U3 halt after ignoring multiple rules including their Rule 6490, the report neglected to mention anything related to MMTLP, even though this has been one of the biggest controversies surrounding FINRA during the relevant period. Instead, they include that GAO omitted from this report information that SEC deemed sensitive. One aspect of interest that should have been included in the report is the effectiveness of FINRA rules. FINRA claims they adhered to their Rule 6490 when they processed the MMTLP corporate actions, but if they did, it would have been impossible for them to miss the issue related to settlement and clearance that they claimed to only discover after posting two separate corporate actions that they were never supposed to create. This means that FINRA had two chances to review the MMTLP corporate action in accordance with their Rule 6490. But how would a review work when it was FINRA that created the corporate actions? Both versions were clearly deficient. How did they ever make it to FINRA's daily list? While I tried to include everything, there are more errors/omissions in Hamilton's blogs that are not included in this presentation. I appreciate those that share this content, those that subscribe to the channel, and those that are understanding of the technical hiccups that often cause bigger issues when fixed. This concludes the presentation.